I'm going to begin with a tale of the Hasidim. Once Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev saw a man in the marketplace, a man so intent upon his business that he never looked up. The Rebbe stopped him and asked, "What are you doing?" The man answered hurriedly, "I have no time to talk to you now." But the tzaddik refused to be snubbed. He repeated his question, "What are you doing?" Impatiently, the man cried out, "Don't delay me. I have to attend to my business." "All right," the rabbi said, "go. But know that everything you're worried about is in the hands of God, and all that is in yours is the awareness of God." Then the man looked up, and for the first time, he knew what the awareness of God was. I'll return to that story. But in this week's parashah, Vayishlach, we read the second of Jacob's two dramatic encounters with the divine. In many ways, the two episodes are parallel. Both are certainly among the Torah's more familiar tales. They've been captured in art. They're stories you probably know or will easily recall. So I'd like to use this opportunity to take a look at them. First, we're going to look at the initial of Jacob's encounters with God from last week's Torah portion. So this is the first text on your handouts, Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 19. So follow with me. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. He came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, for the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. He had a dream. A stairway was set on the ground, and its top reached to the sky, and angels of God were going up and down upon it. And the Lord was standing beside him, and he said, "I am the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying I will assign to you and your offspring. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I'm with you. I will protect you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is present in this place, and I did not know it." Shaken, he said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the abode of God, and that is the gateway to heaven." Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He named that site Bethel, but previously the name of the city had been Luz. So, question. Does anybody recall the narrative setting of this particular story? What has just transpired before this particular text? Yeah.
He ran away because he deceived his brother.
Right.
His brother was going to kill him.
Right, exactly right. So Jacob is fleeing Canaan to Haran. Canaan at one end of the Fertile Crescent, Haran at the top of the Fertile Crescent, and he's running from Esau because Esau has vowed to kill him because what did Jacob steal? His blessing and his birthright, his inheritance. Okay, good. Now, let's take a look at this week's encounter, which we'll read in a couple of moments from the Torah scroll. This is Genesis 32, verses 23 to 33, so you can follow along in the English. That same night he arose, and taking his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 children, he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After taking them across the stream, he sent across all his possessions. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket. So the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Said he, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed." Jacob asked, "Pray tell me your name." But he said, "You must not ask my name." and he took leave of him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, meaning, I have seen a divine being face to face, yet my life has been preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Emanu-El, limping on his hip. That is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. Okay, what's the narrative setting of this text? What's taken place and what is about to? Beg your pardon? Right, so he is leaving his father-in-law Laban, who's in that area of Haran that Jacob had fled to. Now, when is this taking place relative to the first text? 20 years. So 20 years have passed since Jacob fled his brother Esau. He's settled up in Haran. He's married Rachel and Leah, sisters, and their two maidservants as well. He's had many children. He's become rich with his own flocks and herds, and so much so that he actually can't live with his father-in-law anymore. There's beginning to be a strain among them, and so he feels it's time to come back to Canaan. But in order to get back to Canaan, whose land does he have to cross through? Esau's. He's got to cross through the land of Seir, which Esau has come to rule. There's no way to get home without encountering his brother. And last Jacob recalls of his brother, he was bent on killing him for having stolen the birthright and the blessing. And now Jacob has heard that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 soldiers. So Jacob is rightly afraid. Okay, one more text I want to look at. It's less familiar and it's not as dramatic, but it bears certain parallels to the first two. So this is from Genesis 46, much later. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." Okay, what's the narrative setting in this instance? What's taken place and what is about to? Beg your pardon?
Was a famine.
Okay, there was a famine. That's right. Where was the famine? Everywhere, including Canaan, except where? Egypt. Because of whom? Sorry? Joseph, right. Joseph had gone down to Egypt. He'd been imprisoned in Egypt. Pharaoh had recognized his great skill in interpreting dreams. Joseph, and we're going to read this in the coming weeks, realized that there was a famine about to strike, so he said, let's store up everything that we've got, and that way we'll keep the land safe. And there's a famine, strikes the whole region except for Egypt, because Egypt has all this food. And so the whole world now comes to Egypt, including Jacob's family. So what's about to take place in this text that we just read? Beg your pardon? Yeah, Joseph will ultimately reveal himself to his brothers, but Jacob is trying to figure out a question here, whether he should do what? Look at the English. I'm sorry, you need to speak a little bit louder. Yes, the question is whether Jacob should go down to Egypt or not. There's food in Egypt, but what might be his hesitancy about leaving Canaan?
He might get killed.
Well, he might get killed along the way, but what's the significance of Canaan to Jacob?
Joseph is where God
Canaan is the land that God has promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob is concerned that if he leaves Canaan and goes down to Egypt, that covenant, the promise of the land, might go for naught. He might never get back to Canaan, and the Israelites might never have that land that had been promised. So these are the circumstances in which God comes to him in this last text. And okay, so there's some parallels in these three texts. What are some of the parallels? When do they occur in the terms of time of day? Yeah, when in the time of the 24-hour cycle of the day? Nighttime. They all happen at night. All of these happen at night. And Jacob is also alone in each one of these. So at nighttime, and he's alone. Okay, what would you imagine his emotional state to be in each one of them? Let's go back to the first one. What's his emotional state in the first one? He's afraid. He's running for his life. He's exhausted, running through the desert, trying to get away from Esau. Good. In the second, what's his emotional state? Also afraid. What's he afraid of now? Who's he afraid of in this one? Esau. He's afraid Esau is going to kill him and his entire family. And in the third, what's his emotional state here? It's less fear. Yeah, he's uncertain about the whole covenant, whether the covenant will ever be fulfilled or not. Good. So in these three moments, God makes God's presence known to Jacob. And I would suggest to you, in each of these moments, God gives to the patriarch exactly what he needs. He gives Jacob something critical in order for him to take the next step. So what does God give to Jacob in the first encounter? What does God give to Jacob, who is all alone, running from home, perhaps wondering if he's ever going to see home again? What does God give him in that first encounter? Sorry? Protection. God says, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to, in fact, bring you back home again. So, well, Jacob wakes up, and he experiences the awe of God's presence, right? What does God give to Jacob in the second encounter? What does God give to this arrogant, haughty younger brother who's behaved in such an awful way toward his older brother? I'm sorry, you need to speak up.
He gets to see his face, God's face.
Yeah.
Know the presence of God and be renamed by God.
Good. He gets a new name. He gets to see God's punim. I've seen God panim el panim, face to face. But what does God give to Jacob that will perhaps enable him to survive the encounter with his brother that he's so fearful of? It's a gift.
Parallel with fighting his brother if he has to versus fighting the angel?
Maybe that he's had the experience of wrestling with the angel and that prepares him for his brother. This is a little more complicated and nuanced. Esau recalls this arrogant, haughty younger brother. What is Jacob's posture now going to be as he approaches Esau? Beg your pardon? Why?
Because now his hip are
Right. God gives Jacob the gift of a dislocated hip. That doesn't sound like a gift that most of us would want, right? But Esau recalls Jacob being this arrogant young man. Jacob will now be approaching Esau, and the text actually says this, limped over, or hunched over and limping. So when Esau sees him, Esau sees an entirely different brother than the one that he had set out to kill. Okay, the third encounter. What does God give to Jacob there? Right, reassurance that the covenant holds. that he'll go back to Canaan in time. Right.
But why does he refer to Jacob as Jacob after having renamed him Israel?
Good. So Rita asked, why does God continue, and the Bible also continue to refer to Jacob as Jacob after he's been given this new name, Israel? It's a good question, and just because he's given that name, Yisrael, doesn't mean he loses the name Jacob. There's no real answer to it other than that is, in fact, what happens. And the Israelites continually are referred to by the name Israel and by the name Jacob. So I want to just suggest, by way of coming to a close, that Jacob's a pretty complicated figure. I think much more so than Abraham or Isaac. He's a man who knows what his destiny is supposed to be. Rebekah had that vision that the younger son Jacob was to supplant the older son Esau. And Jacob strives at every turn in his life to realize that vision, to come out on top. And he wants to be in control of his fate. And so he lies about his identity to his father Isaac. He swindles his brother Esau. He manipulates his father-in-law Laban. He seems not to trust that God will actually cause things to unfold as they should, as God had said they would. And Jacob acts almost as if God were not a player in the story. In short, Jacob makes very little room for God in his life. And so it's not surprising that this patriarch's two most significant encounters with the divine occur at moments when his resistance is broken by fear and by exhaustion. That's the only moment that God is able to somehow get in. God only appears to Jacob when Jacob is completely vulnerable, when he's tackled from behind, and when control is momentarily wrested from him. And all three of these encounters take place at night when he is sleeping and vulnerable in that way too. And I think there's an interesting message here, I believe, for all of us who tend to approach life as if we were the ones in control, like Jacob, or like the businessman in the Berditchever Rabbi story. We wonder why it is that we don't feel God's presence often enough. Well, maybe it's because feeling God's presence requires a willingness to relinquish a little of that sense of control. And it's not an easy thing for many of us to do. But the story of Jacob suggests that the rewards, the feeling that we're not alone, and that the answers to some of life's most challenging questions are within our reach if we would just see them, those rewards may be worth the effort and the risk, just to let go a little of our sense of control. So I'll be reading this week's parashah, Genesis 32. That's the story of Jacob wrestling with this unidentified figure. And I'll begin with verse 25. So 32, verse 25. We've read the English already, but if you have the Bibles, you can follow along on page 68 in the Hebrew as I read. And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to join me in the bracha, which is on page 213 of the prayer book. Okay, so let's join in the bracha together. Baruch hu et Adonai hamborach, Baruch Adonai hamborach leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'torah. Vayivater Yaakov levado, vayavek ish imo ad alot hashachar. Vayar ki lo yacholo, vayiga bekaf yerecho, vatika kaf yerach Yaakov beheavko imo. Vayomer shalcheni ki Allah hashachar. Vayomer lo ashalechacha ki imberachtani. Vayomer elav ma shemecha. Vayomer Yaakov. Vayomer lo Yaakov yamer od shimcha ki im Yisrael ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim vatuchal. Vayishal Yaakov vayomer hagida na shemecha. Vayomer lama zeh tishal lishmi. Vayivarech oto sham. Vayikra Yaakov shem hamakom Peniel. Ki ra'iti Elohim panim el panim vatinatzel nafshi. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chaye olam nata betochenu. Baruch ata Adonai noten haTorah.